on its surface, the motorcycle move is looking at a gradual rate of club face closing. So I'm going to show you some graphs from AMM as to kind of where this motorcycle move theory kind of came from. And then I'll show you some practical ways that you can train it with the HackMotion sensor. If you enjoy this and you want to know more, as Reinhold said, I've got my website as well as a book on Amazon, and we are in the process of launching a coaching certification that I've been working on the last 2 years. So let's dive in. So these are the kind of a lot of my background stems from looking at AMM data. I've got a pretty good database of tour pros, and I've been using AMM for about 20 years. So I'm going to use a lot of graphs from that. When it comes to looking at consistency, I'd say that's the most common claim or the most common request when golfers come in is they are looking for more consistency. These are the big three graphs that I think give a snapshot as to how consistent a golfer is going to be. You have your kinematic sequence graph. You have the kinematic sequence graph is looking at the overall athleticism or the sequencing of how they're creating speed. The arc width graph is looking at the distance between the mid-hands point on the grip and the sternum or the digitized point in the middle of the chest. And so here, I'll angle that down just a little bit. So the normal pattern for that is we're going to see what we see over here on the right. So it's going to narrow or get closer to the body up towards the top of the swing. It will narrow just slightly in transition and then will widen on the way through impact. The axial velocity graph is looking at the rate of club face twist. When it goes negative, it's rotating open, and when it goes positive, it's rotating closed. I'm going to show you a bunch of graphs where we're going to see this gradually sloping pattern. So we're going to be focusing almost exclusively in this presentation on axial velocity, but the three graphs kind of interplay off of each other. So I'll quickly cover arc width because I think that of the three graphs, we've got kinematic sequence, arc width, and axial velocity. Arc width is probably the single best predictor of consistency level. And then the axial velocity has a really big impact on that arc width graph. I would say that kinematic sequence is actually my third preference if I'm looking for what are we going to do to make a golfer more consistent. So this is just an overhead view of an amateur versus a pro. You can see the amateur down here in the bottom has more of a chicken wing where the arm is bent and the wrist is collapsed and isn't turned quite as much, especially with the pelvis. The arc width graph is kind of a really quick look at this overall pattern, which is basically what we see is with the pro at the top, we'll see a little bit more narrower, or the edge of the blue line is closer towards the target. And then in the follow through, we will see a widening. So it's narrower, or it's more target shifted the entire swing. That's kind of one way to look at the arc width graph. This is the other way, is if you look at a really good classic follow through position where you tend to see good arm extension and body turn, that will usually show up as a really positive arc width graph. Okay. But as I said, the majority of this presentation, we're going to be looking at the motorcycle move, or axial velocity, and we're looking for this gradual club face closing. So these pictures are taken from my book where I'm talking about club face control. We're going to zoom in on each of them, but basically the top one is my representation of a scoop style release. You can see the chicken wing and not a lot of rotation of the forearms. And then the bottom one is my representation of more of a tour style release, where we've got some shaft lean, we've got the arms straight, and we've got a little bit more forearm rotation there in the follow through. If we zoom in and we just hone in on the club face, we're going to look at this picture here to this picture here. If we compare that to the tour one, you will see that in that first picture, so over here at the edge of the screen, you'll see that in the tour version, the club face is more pointed towards the target. So I got a couple arrows there. We can see in the scoop version, it's pointing almost 90 degrees to the target and there's not a lot of space to cover, that club is going to have to rotate quickly in 3D space in order to point at the target. In the tour version, so I left the red arrows so you can see kind of the comparison of about how much more closed. In the tour version, you'll see that the club face is a good 15, 20 degrees more closed with about the same amount of distance to cover. So by getting it to close earlier, it will close slower later. So even if it closes a little bit more after impact, as demonstrated with the blue arrow, the rate coming into impact is going to be lower. That tends to help produce that 3D flat spot, and overall is typically a little bit more consistent, especially with the longer clubs. So here they are kind of shadowed on top of each other. So the goal is to get that club face pointing more towards the target earlier. Well, let's look at a couple examples of this axial velocity graph. You got hopefully a rough idea as far as what it looks like visually. Now we can see what it looks like graphically. So we're going to focus on this graph over here on the left. This slide is taken from one of the presentations where I talk about how these two relate to each other. But if we're just looking at this axial velocity graph, the goal is to have a gentle sloping curve that goes positive quickly after transition and then kind of gradually ramps up as it approaches impact or that second line. Here's another Tour Pro winner demonstrating a similar pattern. And we have a couple who are either have given permission to use their names or are part of the TPI demos. So Steve Elkington, we'll see, has that gradual shape with this little notch. It's remember, if it's still positive, it's closing. So this golfer, Steve Elkington, it's closing and then it kind of slows down closing and then speeds up, but it never really opens. It's just closing at a slightly lower rate. That can still be very consistent. Here's another Tour Pro winner with a more of kind of a abrupt ramp, but it still has kind of this gradual closing that I like to see. Here's another one. Here's Grant Waite, again, demonstrating that little kind of hitch in the pattern, but as a general pattern, you'll see one of the things he does really well is he actually gets it starting even before the top of the swing. So a few examples, you can see a common pattern. You might be wondering, how does that compare to different skill leveled golfers? So here's a couple college golfers who are pretty good. They describe themselves as good ball strikers. So they struggle more with either the short game or in the second case distance. So this golfer, I would say, was a better iron player than driver, but had really good ball striking stats. Here is another one who struggled more with distance than accuracy. He had a really good arc width graph. He was very consistent, but struggled a lot with distance. Now, what does that look like if we compare it to the typical higher handicap golfers? Okay, now we start to see a much bigger difference. So we can see that this golfer is closing early, but then mid downswing starts to open the club or open the face to path relationship and then slams it shut as they approach impact. That would look closer to that chicken wing pattern that I was demonstrating in the first slide. And then you can see over here on the arc width graph, we haven't highlighted it a ton, but again, it's looking at the distance between the grip and the chest. And so what we saw in all those Tour Pro examples is that was widening through impact. This golfer, it gets to its widest at impact and then the arms start to bend. So it actually starts to get narrow right away, right after impact. That look typically results in a lot of inconsistency, both contact and typically direction. So then here's a slightly better golfer, but we can see very little change in the axial velocity for the majority of transition. And then boom, it will start spiking right around impact. That spike is happening from bending those arms and pulling in, as opposed to possibly doing it more from the wrists and the forearms. Okay, so that's kind of the theory of what we're looking for. We're looking for this gradual axial velocity graph. Let's talk about the contributing factors and how we can ultimately get to using HackMotion to help train this. So the contributing factors to the axial velocity graph, the obvious ones are, back up a little bit. So the obvious ones are going to be the lead wrist flexion, which is what the motorcycle movement that TPI kind of coined. That's the most common one. So that's looking at the lead wrist flexing like this. You'll see somewhere around 30 to 40 degrees during the downswing is common. The second piece would be looking at the trail wrist going into extension, at least when the arm is bent. When the club gets more straight out in front, then the twist is going to switch over towards pronation, supination. So there's this blending wrist movement that creates this gradual club face rotation. So when we're looking at getting it closed early, the two main influences from the hands are going to be lead wrist flexion, trail wrist extension. But you should understand that you can influence it from other parts of the body because it's looking at this club in space. So anything that gets it to twist this way, for example, if I increase my torso angle, that's going to help close the club face rotationally. If I pull the arms down, typically if I don't move my wrist, that's going to cause the club face to rotate. And as it gets more out in front, I can do this more with my shoulder movement and less with the forearm movement. So those are the big influences when we're looking at what is going to actually change this axial velocity graph. So we've got a few case studies that we'll look at. So that kind of as a little bit of a word of caution of just going off of one graph. I liked in the last presenter when he talked about take all the information as a whole and then kind of make your claim. You don't want to just go off one particular graph. So here we've got a very good Tour Pro demonstrating that good axial velocity graph. We're going to zoom in on these two wrist graphs. So now, because the wrist graphs are going to look different on each system, I've got the key over here on the left just to help you visualize which side is going into flexion and which side is going into extension. So on this graph, we're looking at the green line exclusively. That's the flexion of the lead wrist or the extension of the trail wrist. When the line goes positive, it's going into flexion. When it goes negative, it's going into extension. So we'll look at these graphs in isolation coming up, but I just wanted to talk through it as the case study because I want you to be able to see if we're zooming in on this part right here, you'll see that it's starting to dip down negative. So from the lead wrist perspective, it's in flexion, but it's actually working slightly towards extension. So that's actually would be by itself opening the club face. We would see a negative dip in the axial velocity graph. But if you remember from that previous slide, it had a really good gradual slope to it. That's because he was getting enough closing from that trail wrist at the same time that lead wrist would have been opening it. And he was also getting the closing from increasing his posture angle. So in this pattern here, we're going to look at a few others where the moral of the story is you want to kind of take all the information as a whole. And that's why I was so excited when HackMotion was able to measure the trail wrist, because you'll see, I think that it has some really good merit for training this motorcycle move, training shaft lean, training some good downswing wrist mechanics. Okay, so here's another one. This is a winner on tour who does go a little bit more into that open pattern early and then closes it late. He closes it fairly gradually from where he comes from, but he does get a little bit more open there in transition. So if we look at it, again, the trail wrist is going into a little bit of extension here as that green line is bottoming out midway down into the downswing. So the trail wrist is closing the face, but the overall pattern that the face is experiencing is happening more from that lead wrist. In addition, he has a little bit of a loss of posture, which tends to open up that face as well. So as we'll scroll through a few of these and then jump into training the individual wrists. So now we've got one more axial velocity graph here, a really good pattern. As we zoom in, we can see, okay, that lead wrist is going into a little bit more extension. That could be a powerful move. Can create some inconsistency, but he did a great job of really increasing the extension of that trail wrist. Again, keeping the good posture angle causes the overall, if we skip back, the overall pattern to be positive, like the club has that gradual closing that we're looking for, even though the lead wrist might be going into a little bit of extension. So you want to be careful, very careful, just looking at one graph, especially if you're just looking at one wrist, because you don't know for sure if there's changes in pressure. So perhaps the grip is actually moving in the hand, which is quite common, or there's other contributing factors. Okay, now we've got a couple amateurs. So you'll see how much longer, or this golfer is opening the club face until a pretty much shaft parallel. So if we zoom in there, we saw that the club was, or the club head was twisting open during the majority of the downswing. Now, if we look at the green line here, we can see that the green line is actually working towards flexion. It's going positively. So the lead wrist was twisting it closed, albeit very gradually, but the trail wrist was twisting it open, and he was twisting it open from the shoulders as well as losing some posture. So the net result was that even though the lead wrist was going in the right direction, it wasn't enough to overpower all the other factors that were causing the club face to open there. Okay, so again, the whole purpose of that is you want to collect all the data if you're going to be using it, and then take a look at it as a whole, because that's going to give you a better snapshot of how the golfer is controlling the club rather than just looking at one individual graph. But now let's look at the individual graphs that we can measure with HackMotion and how I like to train them. So first, let's look at the individual graph looking at the lead wrist. So this is Grant Waite. And again, we're looking at positive going into flexion and then negative going into extension. So as the timeline goes through, basically he's going into some approaching. So let's say he's got 25 or 20 degrees or so at setup, and then he's going to go towards 0 during the takeaway. He's going to extend as he's hinging the wrist. And then the entire downswing, he's basically flexing until the club is roughly around kind of P 6.5, or the club's about 45 degrees right before impact. And then it starts going into more of that extension piece. If we look at Steve Elkington, he's got kind of a similar shape to it, albeit different magnitudes. So he goes from a little bit more extended, say 25 degrees at setup, loses some of that in the takeaway, extends more up towards the top of the swing, and then goes into that flexion move or that motorcycle move pretty much the entire downswing until just 1 or 2 frames before impact. All right, what do the lead wrists for the amateurs look like? Typically, they will be a little bit stiffer. They will be a little bit more flatlined, and you won't see, if we look back at both of those pros, you'll see that impact is typically significantly more flex than wherever it started. So if we look at both of those, he started at 15, he reached about 20 degrees, 18 degrees, something like that, for his peak. If we look at Steve Elkington, he started at 25, he reaches somewhere close to 8 or 10. So there's a significant movement towards that flexion direction. If we look at amateurs, typically if we're just comparing setup and impact, they're often the same. Sometimes I've seen them even be more extended at impact than they were at setup. You'll see that with really big kind of scoop or chicken wing patterns. So even though this golfer is kind of ramping up that wrist, it's covering a very small range, and it's reaching a point that is no more or barely more flex than where it was at setup. Same thing here with another golfer who tends to have more of kind of a little breakdown at impact, where at impact, it's pretty much the exact same. So even though he flexes it there in the takeaway, he loses it the majority of the downswing. That would tend to have a look of kind of an over the top, really spin out pull, kind of steep downswing pattern. Okay, so now let's talk about using HackMotion to train the two main components of the motorcycle move. So the wrists do have the biggest impact. I didn't want to scare you by putting in those graphs and looking at how posture changes it and how shoulders change it, because the wrists do have the biggest impact of it. When it comes to looking at the lead wrist, the goal is to get it moving early and then covering the majority of the downswing. So here's a case study. Here's a golfer who kind of had more of that breakdown chicken wing, arms bend kind of like this on the way through. So he started at about 20 degrees of extension. So remember, I've got the pictures there to help you. He flexed it a little bit as he took it back, extended it up towards the top. Tiny little bit of flexion, but then lost that flexion really early into the downswing, and then kind of really held on and scooped through impact. So we turned on some biofeedback and just practiced kind of going this way a little bit. And then typically when I'm doing this in kind of the first phase, my first goal is to just preset it. So I just want to see, can you get it there and kind of keep it there? I don't expect that he'll be able to do that for a full swing, because the speed of the body bracing and the left shoulder pulling up is going to help the club pull the wrist out of flexion. But on a little 9-3, kind of a 40 or 50 yard shot, I want him to be able to keep it the entire motion. So here was basically the second try working on it. So we just went to the top of the swing, preset that movement, and then tried to keep it all the way through. And he did a reasonable job, lost a tiny bit of it, but then kind of like got started to get this feeling of keeping that wrist flexing through impact. The neat thing was, at the end of doing 20 swings or so, as we added more and more speed, it started to come out more towards impact, but he was able to keep the motorcycle movement, or keep that flexion longer into the downswing. And now when he crosses impact, if we compare that to his first swing, remember, he was kind of that classic pattern where he crossed impact at about the same point where he started. Well, now at least he starts at 17 degrees extended, but he's crossing impact at 2 degrees flex. So he has put in, somewhere around close to 20 degrees of flexion. I usually look for somewhere between 20 and 30. So getting closer and closer to that pattern. Okay, now when we're looking at the trail wrist, I think that this is one of the more powerful ones, especially for your kind of mid single digit, upper single digit golfers. So here we're looking at the trail wrist graph on AMM. So just remember, these guys get switched again. So now extension is negative and flexion is positive. And what we'll see is the pattern on this trail wrist on elite level golfers, I tend to find, is more consistent than even the lead wrist. So this trail wrist is going to extend up towards the top of the swing, and then it's going to extend more in transition, reaching its peak a little bit before P6 or shaft parallel. And then from there, it will start to work towards flexion, but crossing impact, again, somewhere in that 20, 25, maybe 30 degrees on the upper end, more extended than wherever it was at start. So if we look at Steve Elkington, you saw there were some differences in the way that their lead wrists look, but there's a lot more similarities here with the trail wrist pattern. So again, extending, maybe a little bit of just kind of some widening. It's probably not a true cast, because then it downcocks pretty well until, again, about shaft parallel, and then releases through impact. Okay, now if we compare that to amateurs, this is more what we'll see, which is he's going to extend his wrist up towards the top of the swing and reach its maximum pretty close to the top of the swing. So there's more of this kind of 1-2 instead of having this dynamic load or what looks like lag during the downswing. And you'll see impact, he had a tiny bit of shaft lean, but typically you'll see impact close to where it was at setup. So here's another one. reaching its peak right around the top of the swing, and then crossing impact right about where it was at setup. So very little shaft lean. That's more of kind of the scoop style. There's one more just for good measure, reaching its peak right around impact, maybe a tiny bit after, but this one looks more like a downswing cast pattern. He has a tiny bit of shaft lean, so this is kind of someone in that 7-8 handicap zone. Okay, so remember, this is now, instead of looking for the little valley in the downswing, now we're looking for a peak. So this golfer had more of, there's the peak right at the top of the swing, and then pretty much a straight cast. We did a little biofeedback training where we set the tone to about where we wanted, so somewhere around 60 degrees for this particular golfer. And then the instructions were no tone at the top of the swing, and then tone during the downswing. And anytime you didn't feel the, or anytime you heard the tone at the top of the swing, you had to stop. So this was basically working on getting a little bit of that more kind of lag move or float load. So then this was that second swing. You can see after doing a little bit of the biofeedback training, it was pretty easy to get in place. Now, this golfer struggled with contact. So we'll talk a little bit about some of these contributing factors. So it's easy to get the wrist graph to change. What's harder is to get that change to stick and work with the other pieces. So if you're working on the motorcycle movement and you're struggling getting that change to transfer into the full swing, you want to look at some of the big complementary movements, which is thinking about when the wrists move the club back that way, it's going to narrow it. So it's going to pull the club off the ground. So I need to have more side bend, more torso rotation, more ulnar deviation, something to then lower that club closer to the ground. It's also going to move the low point backward. So I need to have, again, more of that rotation, potentially more forearm rotation. I need to have some things that then move the bottom of the swing back forward to balance it back out. And the big one there is this shoulder rotation. So a lot of golfers get either too dominant in creating power from going into internal rotation of that trail shoulder. It's really hard to extend the wrist while going into internal rotation against the resistance of what the club is doing. Or with the lead shoulder, you'll tend to see more of a pull or retraction. So if you tend to pull this way, that will typically make the wrist want to pull into extension as well. So if you're struggling with some of those movements, especially as you start to add speed, you want to be able to troubleshoot and work through replacing what you're taking away by adding the good gradual club face closing, or the motorcycle movement, as we like to call it. So again, of the big three graphs, I tend to think that the arc width graph is the most representative of what creates consistency. But the cool thing about the axial velocity graph is when you work on the axial velocity graph, it tends to influence the kinematic sequence, and it tends to influence the arc width graph. I don't typically see the same thing. If you give someone just a cue to work on sequencing, it's rare that the arc width graph changes a lot. Sometimes that happens, but it's even more rare that the axial velocity graph changes. So you do have to usually work on this directly if you're trying to change one of those patterns where we see the really late closing after staying open during the whole downswing. And I find that the biofeedback training, especially on that trail wrist, tends to be really helpful in changing that pattern. So you're going to hear a ton about this flexion of the lead wrist and extension of the trail wrist. I wanted to take my opportunity with the presentation to kind of hopefully tie in a little bit of the theory why, so that you'll understand why you're going to hear some of the coaches prescribing what they do. Again, if you have any questions, you can check out my book on Amazon or my site, Golf Smart Academy, and stay tuned for the launch of our new coaches certification, where we go through all the key movements of the golf swings, both from an anatomical point of view as well as from a graph point of view. And with that, I'll open it up if there's any questions.
There's a question about how much does supination of lead forearm contribute to motorcycle move. I find it really hard to do the motorcycle move without supination of lead forearm.
Yes. So I didn't talk about that in this presentation, but typically with that tour style release, you're going to see a total range of supination of somewhere around 120 degrees, and many amateurs are more like 90 or 80. So by getting that supination to happen earlier and work kind of over a long, slow period, that does build that gradual club face closing. So it's definitely a piece of the motorcycle move.
One question about, do you see a trend of moving towards more flexion among tour players? What do you see trends in the overall and how the swings are of top?
You mean like top of the backswing, like people getting more Colin Morikawa, Dustin Johnson?
Exactly.
Yeah.
How would you comment on that?
So most of the big movements that create power tend to open the club face. So if you bias yourself to getting a little bit more closed, then it allows you to do some more powerful dynamic things on the downswing. So it's a bell curve. I think you can overdo any of those pieces, but as long as it doesn't impede you from getting your body into a good position, that works really well. The problem I see is for a lot of amateurs, you have to match these pieces up. So the problem I see for a lot of amateurs is they'll have a stronger grip, they'll do some bowing, and then the club face will be really closed. And instead of solving it by getting more rotation and side bend, they'll tend to solve it by kind of holding the club face from rotating, which messes up contact and low point. So they can be decent drivers of the golf ball, but they struggle a lot with scoring because their iron play is not quite where it could be. So that's the only kind of caution with getting too aggressive with closing it at the top.